After the fall of Nicaea, the Crusaders were eager to push forward. The siege had been long and exhausting, but the city's capture was only the first step. Now they stood on the threshold of the next phase of the campaign, moving deeper into Seljuk-controlled territory. In addition to their goal of Jerusalem, Antioch, a key city in northern Syria, had been added as a strategic objective for the Crusaders. This was a critical stronghold on their way to the Holy Land. The Crusaders would need to capture Antioch to secure their route to Jerusalem, as it was an important center for trade and military movement. This was a critical moment, and Emperor Alexios called for a meeting with the Crusader leaders to discuss the next steps. Alexios, the Byzantine emperor who had played a significant role in initiating the crusade, understood the strategic importance of the moves that lay ahead. Although Nicaea had fallen into Crusader hands, the road to Jerusalem was fraught with danger. He knew that the Seljuk Turks, despite their recent defeat, remained a formidable force, and he sought to share this vital intelligence with the Crusaders. Throughout the spring and summer, Emperor Alexios had furnished the crusade with invaluable advice on how to approach the next stages of the campaign. In a private briefing, he detailed the Seljuk Turks' military tactics, emphasizing their skill in hit-and-run attacks, surprise raids, and guerrilla-style warfare. Alexios made it clear that the Crusaders should not expect a traditional battle, but rather a series of skirmishes and ambushes that would make their march to Jerusalem even more perilous. Alexios also stressed the importance of cooperation between the Byzantines and the Crusaders. He reminded them that while they had captured Nicaea, the land that they had taken remained within the sphere of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines had knowledge of the lands and the shifting alliances within the region, intelligence that was critical for the Crusaders' success. He also offered advice on how to confront the Seljuk Turks, how to draw up battle lines, lay ambushes, and avoid being drawn too far when the enemy feigned retreat. Alexios had seen firsthand how the Turks could lure enemies into overextending themselves. At this meeting, Alexios revealed that the Seljuk leaders had retreated to Dorylaeum. This would be the next major obstacle in the Crusaders' path. Alexios offered his counsel on how to approach this stronghold and assured the Crusaders that his troops would assist in securing the region, but only if they respected the Byzantine Empire's authority over the lands that they would reconquer. Alexios' plan was to follow the Crusaders' march, mopping up any territory that they had conquered. To ensure his control over the unfolding events, he sent Taticius, his trusted representative, to accompany the Crusaders with a small force of Byzantine troops. Despite their eagerness to continue their journey towards Jerusalem, the Crusaders had little choice but to accept Alexios' intelligence and his terms. The Byzantine Empire, after all, remained a crucial ally in the fight ahead, and the Seljuk Turks would prove to be a much greater challenge than anticipated. As the Crusaders prepared to leave Nicaea in the last week of June 1097, Alexios could look back over the preceding months with some satisfaction. The Crusaders had been channeled through his empire without major incident, and a significant blow had been struck against Kilij Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan. Despite occasional friction, the Crusaders had largely been cooperative under Alexios' guidance. The question now was how long this cooperation would last once the Crusaders moved further from Byzantine territory, heading towards Jerusalem and the heart of Muslim-controlled lands. The path to Jerusalem would be anything but straightforward. By the summer of 1097, the crusade was no longer a vision, it was an army. A patchwork of nobles, knights, priests, and pilgrims united not by blood or banner, but by a vow, to reach Jerusalem and reclaim it in the name of Christ. But there was no single leader. Instead, power lay in the hands of competing princes, each with his own ambitions, loyalties, and legacy to build. At the head of the Norman contingent was Bohemond of Taranto, a war-hardened son of southern Italy. Tall, commanding, and charismatic, Bohemond had the instincts of a battlefield tactician and the appetite of a conqueror. He hadn't come just to liberate holy ground, he came to carve out a kingdom. Alongside him rode Tancred, his young and ambitious nephew, forever in Bohemond's shadow and eager to prove himself. From northern France came Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine. Pious, stoic, and quietly formidable, Godfrey had already sold his lands to fund the journey. Unlike Bohemond, he sought no crown, only salvation and the path of the righteous knight. By his side was his brother Baldwin. Where Godfrey dreamed of holy glory, Baldwin saw opportunity, and in time, he would claim a crown of his own. The elder statesman of the crusade was Raymond of Toulouse, a seasoned nobleman in his 50s and one of the wealthiest men in France. Raymond styled himself as the true standard-bearer of the faith, often clashing with Bohemond over leadership. With Raymond rode Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, appointed by Pope Urban II himself as the spiritual guide of the crusade. Though not a warrior, Adhemar's presence kept the princes from tearing each other apart and reminded them why they had taken the cross to begin with. And then there were others: Robert, Duke of Normandy and son of William the Conqueror, valiant, reckless, and chronically underfunded. Stephen of Blois, his brother-in-law, pious and prominent but easily shaken, and a multitude of minor nobles, knights, and foot soldiers from across Frankish, German, and Italian lands, many of whom would never see Jerusalem. Together, they formed the Prince's Crusade, an army unlike any seen in Christendom. After the Crusaders captured Nicaea, they began their march eastward through the vast and unfamiliar landscape of Anatolia. Spirits were high after the victory, but the Crusaders quickly realized that the road to Jerusalem would be anything but easy. Alongside the noble knights and military leaders, a number of common people from the People's Crusade, who had joined the Prince's Crusade after the failure of their own campaign, now marched with them. These civilians, many of whom were less prepared for the hardships of war, faced the same challenges as the professional soldiers, further burdening the Crusader army. Despite their fervor, the Crusaders, though well-disciplined, were ill-prepared for the type of warfare they would face as they ventured deeper into Seljuk-controlled territory. The sheer size of the Crusader army made it impossible for them to move as a single unified force. Stretching over the vast Roman roads and pilgrimage routes ahead, the column of nearly 70,000 men, women, and children took days to pass any given point. As they advanced, the Crusaders foraged for food and supplies, devastating the surrounding countryside as they searched for resources. This massive movement placed a great strain on the Crusader forces, but they could not afford to break into smaller groups. The Seljuk Turks, led by Kilij Arslan, still posed a significant threat, and the Crusaders were fully aware of the dangers they faced if they were separated. On the 26th of June, 1097, the Crusader army split into two main contingents, each led by a prominent figure of the Crusade. The first group was commanded by Bohemond, his nephew Tancred, Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, and the Byzantine general Tatisius. This force was positioned at the front of the march, with Bohemond and his men leading the charge towards their next objective. The second group, which followed slightly behind, was led by Godfrey with his brother Baldwin, Raymond of Toulouse, Stephen of Blois, and Hugh of Vermandois, who brought up the rear. The plan was to rendezvous at Dorylaeum, an abandoned Byzantine military camp, located 4 days southeast. This camp, while deserted, would provide the perfect location for the Crusaders to regroup and prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. However, the Crusaders' plans were about to be disrupted. Kilij Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan of Rum, had been biding his time. Despite his humiliating defeat at Nicaea, Kilij Arslan had been busy amassing a significant force. With his army now reinforced, he saw an opportunity to strike back at the Crusaders. The fact that the Crusader army had divided itself into two separate groups made them much more vulnerable, and Kilij Arslan knew this would be the perfect chance to launch an ambush and disrupt their advance across Anatolia. On the 29th of June, 1097, Bohemond noticed that his army was being shadowed by Seljuk scouts. He suspected that the Seljuks were planning to ambush them near Dorylaeum. Contemporary figures place the number of Seljuk Turks as between 6,000 and 8,000 men. Bohemond and Robert's forces probably numbered about 10,000, and that's not counting a large number of non-combatants, the majority of these people on foot. On the evening of June 30th, after 3 grueling days of marching, Bohemond's army made camp in a meadow along the north bank of a river near the ruins of Dorylaeum. At dawn on July 1st, Kilij Arslan's forces launched a surprise attack. Seljuk mounted archers, known for their speed and precision, descended upon the Crusader camp, shooting arrows into the Crusader lines before the Crusaders could fully mount a defense. The attack was swift and overwhelming, catching the Crusaders by surprise. Bohemond's knights quickly mounted onto their horses to engage the enemy, but the Seljuk archers, who were skilled at firing while in motion, harassed them relentlessly, striking their horses and soldiers from a distance. One Crusader soldier later recalled the chaos, saying, "The Seljuks began all at once to howl and gabble and shout, saying with loud voices in their own language some devilish word which I do not understand, screaming like demons." The Seljuk cavalry rode into the camp, cutting down unarmed civilians, foot soldiers, and anyone who was caught off guard. The Crusaders were thrown into disarray. The unarmored foot soldiers, who were unable to outrun the Seljuk horses, were the most vulnerable. Bohemond, realizing the severity of the situation, ordered his knights to dismount and form a defensive line. With the help of Tancred and his forces, they managed to gather the non-combatants and foot soldiers into the center of the camp for protection. The women of the camp, acting under Bohemond's orders, took up the task of carrying water to the soldiers during the battle. Amid the chaos, one eyewitness described the horror. "The Turks were howling like wolves and furiously shooting a cloud of arrows. We were stunned by this." Despite the brutal attack, the Crusaders held firm. The Turks' arrows, while deadly, were mostly ineffective against the heavily armored knights. However, the Crusaders' horses suffered greatly, with many falling to the Seljuk arrows. The Seljuk strategy of constant harassment was taking its toll, and the Crusaders found themselves forced back to the marshy riverbanks, where the ground was too soft for the Turkish horses to charge effectively. For hours, the Crusader knights fought to maintain their position. The marshy ground provided some protection from the Turkish cavalry, but the Seljuks kept their archers well supplied and continued to launch arrows from all directions. The Crusaders struggled to hold their ground against the relentless assault, as small groups of knights would occasionally break ranks and charge at the Turks, only to be slaughtered or driven back by the Seljuk cavalry. Amid the chaos, the Crusaders passed a morale-boosting phrase down the line: "Stand fast together, trusting in Christ and the victory of the Holy Cross. Today, may we all gain much booty." Despite the bloodshed and confusion, the Crusaders managed to regroup and continue their resistance. But just when it seemed the Seljuk Turks might overwhelm the Crusaders, help finally arrived. Godfrey and his contingent arrived with reinforcements, charging through the Turkish lines to relieve Bohemond's forces. The arrival of Godfrey and his knights allowed the Crusaders to establish their position, but the battle was far from over. As the Turkish attacks grew fiercer, more Crusader reinforcements arrived, including forces from Raymond and Hugh of Vermandois. By midday, the tide of the battle began to turn. Raymond and his forces, arriving from the rear, launched a surprise attack on the Seljuk flank, taking the Turks by surprise and causing them to retreat in disarray. This breakthrough allowed the Crusaders to regroup and rally against the Seljuk forces. The Crusaders formed a defensive line with Bohemond, Tancred, Robert, and Stephen on the left wing, Raymond and Robert in the center, and Godfrey and Hugh on the right. As the Crusaders pressed the attack, they were aided by the arrival of Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate, who brought additional forces to the battlefield. The Crusader knights, well armored and disciplined, pushed forward with renewed vigor. The Seljuks, now facing an assault from both the front and the rear, began to crumble. The Crusaders' relentless push, combined with the sight of their camp being set ablaze, forced Kilij Arslan to order a retreat. In the face of fierce Crusader resistance and the fire consuming their supplies, the Turks fled the battlefield, abandoning their camp and leaving the Crusaders with a hard-won victory. The Battle of Dorylaeum was a pivotal moment for the Crusaders. Although they had suffered casualties, the battle demonstrated their ability to withstand a determined and well-coordinated attack by the Seljuk Turks. The Turkish retreat marked the end of the immediate threat, and the Crusaders, now in possession of Kilij Arslan's treasury and camp, celebrated their hard-fought victory. However, the Seljuk Turks remained a threat, and the Crusaders knew that their journey to Jerusalem would continue to be fraught with dangers. But for now, the Crusaders had proven that their resolve could withstand even the fiercest challenges. After their victory at Dorylaeum in June 1097, the Crusaders continued their long march eastward towards Antioch, a vital stronghold in their path to Jerusalem. While their victory over Kilij Arslan and the Seljuk Turks was a significant boost to morale, the challenges of the march were far from over. The Crusaders now faced the grueling task of crossing Anatolia, an unfamiliar and harsh landscape that would test their endurance and resolve. Anatolia, stretching from the fertile lands of Central Asia to the Mediterranean, is a region of great contrasts: barren deserts, rugged mountains, and vast plains, often with little water or shelter. The Crusaders were ill-prepared for the challenges posed by this unforgiving land. The heat of the summer months took its toll on the soldiers, and as they were marching under the scorching sun, they often didn't have enough food or water to sustain their massive army. The terrain was difficult to navigate, with rocky hills and mountain passes that slowed the Crusaders' progress. In some regions, the Roman roads that the Crusaders followed were in disrepair, while in others, there were no roads at all, forcing the army to march across difficult, uneven terrain. The Crusaders were now stretched thin over long distances, with some parts of the army lagging behind, unable to keep pace with the faster-moving vanguard. The vast size of the Crusader army, numbering nearly 70,000 men, women, and children, compounded the difficulty of the journey. In addition to the trained knights and soldiers, the army included a significant number of non-combatants, families, pilgrims, and civilians from the People's Crusade who were less prepared for the harsh realities of the campaign. These civilians contributed to the army's burden, slowing its march and making the logistics of supplying such a large group even more challenging. The Crusaders were constantly foraging for food, sometimes stripping the surrounding countryside bare in search of provisions. They had no choice but to rely on the land, but this often led to the resentment of local populations, as the Crusaders' passage was marked by the devastation of the resources they encountered. One chronicler recalls the situation. Overwhelmed by the anguish of thirst, as many as 500 people died. In addition, horses, donkeys, camels, mules, oxen, and many animals suffered the same death from very painful thirst. Many men, growing weak from the exertion and the heat, gaping with open mouths and throats, were trying to catch the thinnest mist to cure their thirst. Now, while everyone was thus suffering with this plague, a river they had longed and searched for was discovered. As they hurried towards it, each was keen because of excessive longing to arrive first amongst the great throng. They set no limit to their drinking, until very many who had been weakened, as many men as beasts of burden, died from drinking too much. As the Crusaders moved deeper into Seljuk-controlled Anatolia, they encountered the persistent threat of the Seljuk Turks, who used their superior knowledge of the land and their mobility to harass the Crusader forces. While the Seljuk cavalry was no longer able to engage the Crusaders head-on after their defeat at Dorylaeum, they resorted to hit-and-run tactics, ambushing small Crusader parties and raiding their supply lines. These raids, though not decisive, were demoralizing, and they wore down the Crusaders' already depleting resources. Kilij Arslan, though driven from the battlefield, had not given up on his efforts to slow the Crusaders' advance. He knew that the key to stopping the Crusaders lay in breaking their spirit and weakening their resolve. His forces would strike at vulnerable points in the Crusader army, particularly targeting supply wagons and foraging parties, making it difficult for the Crusaders to maintain their momentum. Though the Crusader leadership, including Bohemond and Godfrey of Bouillon, worked to keep the forces together and remain vigilant, the Seljuk harassment remained a constant challenge. In addition to Seljuk attacks, the Crusaders had to contend with internal strife and logistical problems. The army, already burdened by its size and the participation of so many non-combatants, began to experience growing tensions. The leaders had to work hard to maintain unity and morale, and the presence of rivalries between the Crusader princes added to the complexity of their situation. As the Crusaders pushed forward, they began to rely more heavily on local allies, particularly Christian forces in the region. The Armenian Christians from the city of Edessa were among the first to offer support, providing much-needed supplies and guiding the Crusaders through some of the more treacherous areas in Anatolia. These local Christians not only helped navigate the difficult terrain, but also shared their knowledge of the Seljuks' movements and strategies. However, this alliance came with complications. Many of the local Armenians had their own political ambitions, and hoped to use the Crusaders as leverage in their struggles against the Seljuk Turks and other Muslim forces. The Crusaders, while grateful for the help, were wary of getting too involved in local politics, knowing that any shift in power could either aid or hinder their progress towards Jerusalem. In some cases, the Crusaders also had to negotiate with Muslim rulers who controlled parts of the land that they were passing through. Although these rulers were often hostile to the Crusaders' cause, there were instances where limited trade agreements were struck, providing the Crusaders with supplies in exchange for safe passage. The Crusaders, however, remained focused on their ultimate goal, the capture of Jerusalem. The march across Anatolia was not only a physical and tactical challenge, but also a spiritual and psychological one. The Crusaders' faith in their mission, their belief that they were acting on behalf of God, was tested on this difficult journey. The hardships they faced, the constant threats from the Seljuks, the grueling heat, the lack of supplies, and the internal strife made many wonder if they would ever even reach Jerusalem. Yet through these challenges, the Crusaders maintained their unity. Religious fervor played a significant role in keeping the soldiers motivated. They were determined to capture the holy city, and their shared belief in the righteousness of their cause helped them to endure the trials of their journey. As they marched, they would often chant prayers and hymns, reinforcing their unity and their purpose. Despite the hardships, the Crusaders felt a deep sense of destiny driving them forward. After weeks of grueling travel, the Crusaders finally neared Antioch in late October 1097. The city, a key objective on their path to Jerusalem, lay ahead, and the Crusaders could see the promise of victory within their grasp. However, they would first need to lay siege to the city and deal with the Seljuk defenders, who were determined to prevent the Crusaders from gaining control of the city. The siege of Antioch was one of the most brutal and pivotal moments of the First Crusade. This city, situated on the Orontes River, was not just another fortified position. It was a key military, commercial, and strategic hub in the eastern Mediterranean, and its capture would open the path for the Crusaders towards their ultimate goal. But Antioch was fiercely defended, and its fall would not come easy. Founded by Seleucus I Nicator in 300 BCE, Antioch had long been an influential city in the region. It was the capital of the Seleucid Empire, and later a major city under the Romans and the Byzantine Empire. Located at the crossroads of major trade routes, Antioch connected the Mediterranean with the fertile plains of Mesopotamia and the wealth of the Persian and Arabian lands. It was the gateway to Syria and the Holy Land, making it an indispensable asset for any power in the region. The Crusaders understood its value, and so did the Seljuk Turks, who had fortified the city for a long siege. The city's thick defensive walls, built by the Romans and reinforced over centuries, would prove to be a formidable obstacle for the Crusaders. Antioch's defensive advantage was bolstered by its position, surrounded by rugged hills and mountains, making it difficult for an army to approach without significant effort. At the heart of the city's defenses was Alexios, the Seljuk governor of Antioch, who commanded a garrison of around 5,000 troops. Though his forces were insufficient to launch an open battle against the much larger Crusader army, Alexios' men were tasked with manning the city's defenses, its thick walls, gate, and towers. The Seljuks were well prepared to hold the city, and their defensive strategy was clear: buy time, force the Crusaders to expend their resources, and wait for reinforcements from Kerboga, the Seljuk general leading forces in Mosul. The Seljuks had plenty of provisions and were ready to outlast the Crusaders in a long siege. The problem was not just the military strength of the defenders, but the psychological and physical toll that the siege would impose on both sides. On October 21st, 1097, the Crusaders began their siege of Antioch. They deployed a classical medieval encirclement siege, surrounding the city with barricades and makeshift siege engines. This was a long and grueling process, building trenches, constructing siege towers, and setting up battering rams to break down the thick walls. The Crusaders, already exhausted from their long march across Anatolia, now found themselves engaged in a battle of attrition against both the city's fortifications and the harsh conditions outside. The physical toll on the Crusaders was devastating. They were already malnourished and suffering from disease. As winter approached, the cold and scarcity of resources further drained their strength. They had to resort to foraging from the surrounding countryside, but this only exacerbated the situation. The Crusaders, whose army numbered around 70,000, struggled to maintain a steady supply of food and water. Disease ran rampant, with soldiers falling victim to dysentery, typhus, and the plague. The food they did find was often in short supply, and it was reported that they were reduced to eating dogs, rats, and anything else they could scavenge. Psychologically, the siege wore on the Crusaders as well. The constant threat of attack, the scarcity of resources, and the pressure of holding their position began to fray their morale. The Crusaders were not just fighting against Alexios' men, they were also engaged in a battle of wills with the Seljuk Turks, who were equally determined to hold the city and break the siege. The walls of Antioch became a symbol of the Turks' defiance, and the Crusaders, desperate to weaken their resolve, began a brutal psychological campaign to break the defenders. As the siege dragged on, both sides engaged in grisly exchanges meant to break each other's morale. The Crusaders, in a display of both brutality and psychological warfare, decapitated more than 100 Muslim dead from previous skirmishes, and mounted their heads on spears, parading them around the city's walls. The Seljuk defenders, desperate to demoralize the Crusaders, retaliated by executing some of the Christian population of Antioch, Greeks, Syrians, and Armenians, who lived within the city. Their heads were catapulted over the walls and hurled towards the Crusaders' camp. The Crusaders saw these grim tokens as proof of the Seljuks' cruelty. Inside Antioch, Yagisian and his forces were also engaged in a battle for resources. The garrison was relatively small for a city of Antioch's size, and maintaining their hold of the walls while also providing for their own forces was a constant strain. Meanwhile, the Crusader camp faced internal strife. The Byzantine general Taticius, at this point disillusioned with the Crusader leadership, left the expedition in late December 1097, taking with him the Byzantine reinforcements. Taticius had explained to Emperor Alexios that Bohemond had informed him of a plot to kill him, as they believed Alexios was secretly encouraging the Seljuks. Those close to Bohemond claimed that Taticius's departure was due to treachery or cowardice, and that this was reason enough to break any obligation to return Antioch to the Byzantines. The strained relationship between the Byzantines and the Crusaders was growing worse by the day. Alongside all this, Peter the Hermit, once the passionate leader of the People's Crusade, also tried to desert the cause. He was caught attempting to flee in the middle of the night and was dragged back by Tancred, an event that further damaged the Crusaders' unity. The growing tensions and the divisions within the ranks reflected the ever-deepening pressures of the siege and the long road ahead. Many women and non-combatants were expelled from the Crusader camp, with some fleeing all the way back to Europe to escape the horrors of the siege. The Crusaders were suffering immensely, and the psychological toll of the siege was being felt just as much by Yagisian's men. They could see the desperation of the Crusaders mounting, and the catapulted heads were a brutal reminder of how far each side was willing to go to break the other's spirit. By March 4th, 1098, the siege was finally beginning to shift in the Crusaders' favor. With the arrival of spring, the conditions that had so long tested the Crusaders' resolve began to change. The system of foraging centers established by the Crusaders helped alleviate some of the logistical strains, providing them with more resources. The arrival of a small fleet of English ships, carrying food, building materials, and skilled craftsmen, also brought vital supplies. The Crusaders, aided by Bohemond and Raymond of Toulouse, escorted the cargo back from the coast, despite the looming threats of Seljuk raids. With these reinforcements, the Crusaders were able to sustain their siege efforts, and the morale of Yagisian's defenders began to wane. Although Kerboga's relief army was still on the move, the arrival of supplies and the Crusaders' determination to break the city's defenses gave them new life. As spring 1098 began to thaw the winter chill, and the siege of Antioch continued, the Crusaders' grip on the city steadily tightened. They had constructed a formidable network of fortified positions around the city, cutting off Yagisian's supply lines and establishing a deadly encirclement. But the pressure was taking a toll on both sides, and the resolve of both the Crusaders and the Seljuk defenders was about to be tested like never before. Up until this point, Yagisian had been using Antioch's bridge gate with relative impunity. The Crusaders, however, had created their own defensive bastion near the bridge gate. They fortified a derelict mosque at the entrance to this gate and named it the Blessed Mary. This newly established fort allowed them to police the area and secure some control over this important access point. Meanwhile, the Crusaders also improvised a siege fort at the Gate of St. George, which remained the city's last accessible entrance. Tancred, known for his sharp military mind, was placed in charge of this post for a hefty payment of 400 silver marks. The gate was now another strong point in the Crusaders' encirclement, allowing them to monitor the Muslims' movements and suppress any efforts to break the siege. By April 1098, the Crusaders' siege strategy had begun to wear down the defenders. The Seljuk defenders were increasingly isolated, their resources were running low, while the Crusaders were able to dig in and continue their siege operations. The Seljuk defenders, though still holding their position, could see the writing on the wall. Resources were scarce, morale was waning, and the walls of Antioch were slowly becoming a prison rather than a fortress. For the Crusaders, the psychological battle was just as grueling as the physical one. They were haunted by the constant fear of a Muslim relief force arriving to break the siege and crush their efforts. Dukak of Damascus and Ridwan of Aleppo had both responded to Yagisian's call for reinforcements, sending small contingents in December 1097 and in February 1098. While their forces were not enough to break the Crusaders, they did delay their advance, and the fear that more reinforcements would come remained ever present. However, the Crusaders were very fortunate that Dukak and Ridwan were engaged in their own conflict, a civil war that distracted them from focusing on the Crusader threat. Had they set aside their rivalry, the Crusaders might have faced a much more formidable opposition. But as it stood, the Crusaders defeated those smaller forces with minimal losses. By the early summer of 1098, the Crusaders heard rumor that a new and terrifying enemy was on the horizon. The Sultan of Baghdad, responding to Antioch's desperate calls for help, had finally mobilized an army. Scouts brought back the terrifying news on May 28th. A massive relief force was marching towards Antioch under the control of Kerboga, a feared general from Mosul. With an army of around 40,000 troops drawn from Syria and Mesopotamia, Kerboga's army was on the move, 1 week away from Antioch. The Crusaders now faced a dire dilemma. They were vastly outnumbered, and their position was becoming more precarious by the day. The news that Kerboga was on his way sent a wave of panic through the Crusader leadership. An emergency council was convened, and the princes of the Crusade debated their next moves. Their current strategy had worked so far. Antioch's defenders were weakening, but the Crusaders knew that they could not withstand a full-scale battle against Kerboga's massive army. They were outnumbered and exhausted, and the prospect of facing a fresh Muslim army was terrifying to them. It was in this moment of desperation that Bohemond revealed his master plan. Over the course of the siege, Bohemond had made contact with a renegade Armenian tower commander named Firuz. This man, positioned inside Antioch, was ready to betray the city. Bohemond's plan was risky, but potentially game-changing. If the Crusaders could infiltrate the city and open the gates from the inside, they could launch a surprise attack on the Seljuk defenders and take the city. However, the Crusaders' situation was precarious. On June 2, 1098, Stephen of Blois and several others deserted the army, unable to bear the hardships of the siege any longer. This defection only added fuel to the already existing tensions between the Crusader leaders. Raymond of Toulouse was furious with Bohemond, and he argued that the city should be handed over to Emperor Alexios, as they had agreed when they left Constantinople in 1097. The promise to return Antioch to the Byzantines had been a key part of their alliance, but now, in the face of dwindling supplies and morale, Raymond felt that they should honor their agreement. Yet Godfrey, Tancred, Robert of Normandy, and the other leaders, confronted with a desperate situation, gave in to Bohemond's demand to take the city for themselves. The Byzantines were to be left out of the final victory. Firuz instructed Bohemond to feign a march south over the mountains to ostensibly confront Kerboga, the Muslim general marching to relieve Antioch. But the true plan was far more daring. Bohemond would lead the Crusaders to double back during the night, scaling the walls at the Tower of the Two Sisters, where Firuz had arranged to be waiting. On the night of June 2, 1098, Bohemond and a small group of his men carried out their plan. Using an ox-hide ladder, they scaled a poorly guarded section of the city's south wall where Firuz was waiting. The risks were enormous, and if the plan failed and an alarm was raised, the Crusaders would be slaughtered. But the operation went off without a hitch. The guards at the nearest towers were quickly dispatched, and a small gate was opened below to allow the rest of the Crusader forces to enter. With the gate open, Bohemond signaled the attack. The calm night air was shattered by the sound of Crusader bugles, signaling the attack. The Crusaders charged into the city, and the cry of Deus Vult, or God wills it, echoed through the streets. Yagisian's garrison was thrown into utter confusion. The gates were flung open and the Crusaders flooded into the city. What followed was a chaotic, bloodthirsty rampage. The Crusaders, long deprived of victory, released 8 months of pent-up anger. One chronicler described the carnage, saying, They were sparing no Muslim on the grounds of age or sex. The ground was covered with blood and corpses, and some of these were Christian Greeks, Syrians, and Armenians. No wonder, since, in the darkness, they were entirely unaware of whom they should spare and whom they should strike. Another crusader wrote, "All the streets of the city on every side were full of corpses, so that no one could endure to be there because of the stench, nor could anyone walk along the narrow paths of the city except over the corpses of the dead." Amidst the slaughter, Bohemond made sure that his red banner was raised high above the city, marking the Crusaders' victory. The city had fallen, but the citadel had still held out, with Yaghi-Sian's son commanding the last Muslim stronghold. Yaghi-Sian himself fled the city in terror, only to be caught and decapitated by a local peasant. The Crusaders' victory was hard won, but it came at a steep cost. As the Crusader forces celebrated their success, the relief force under Kerboga had already arrived at the gates of Antioch on June 4th, 1098, just one day after the city's fall. With the arrival of Kerboga's army, the Crusaders found themselves trapped. Antioch was now surrounded on all sides by Muslim forces, and the Crusaders, still reeling from the violence of their conquest, had to prepare to face an even greater threat. The victory at Antioch was brief, for the Crusaders' survival now depended on how they would face Kerboga's vastly superior forces. The siege had ended, but a new battle was about to begin, and the Crusaders' fate hung in the balance.